You are all very, very welcome to this EBA seminar, Swedish Research Aid, which is arranged by EBA, the expert group for aid studies. And we are very pleased to see that many have accepted our invitation to come here, and we look forward to a very fruitful day. My name is Gun-Britt Andersson, and I am at present the acting chairperson for the expert group. I have retired from active full-time service, but I have in the past worked with development cooperation issues in various capacities. Of special relevance today is that I was a member of the team tasked long ago, more than 40 years ago, by the Swedish government to establish what became SAREC in 1975. What about the expert group? Who are we? The expert group for aid studies is a government committee responsible for evaluating and analyzing Sweden's international development cooperation. We produce studies and organize seminars, on issues of importance to Swedish development cooperation. We want to contribute to improvement. The work of EBA is characterized by dual independence. This means that EBA independently decides what to study, to commission and to publish, and the authors on their part are fully responsible for the content. We do have reference groups to assist them, but it's the authors that are responsible. Of course, we take responsibility also for that we publish it, but not for the content. Our ambition is to build bridges between policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. And we hope that our seminars are a natural meeting point for interaction and dialogue on central aspects of development cooperation. And I think that your presence here today is promising from that respect. Because today we have the pleasure of launching 2 reports focusing on Swedish research aid. The first report, Research Capacity in the New Global Development Agenda, Mobility, Collaboration and Scientific Production among Ph.D. graduates, supported by Swedish Development Aid in Africa, is written by Måns Fellesson, a researcher at REMESO, which I don't know what means, and he will tell you, and a deputy director at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And the second report, Research Aid Revisited, a historically grounded analysis of future prospects and policy options, is written by Sverker, Sörlin and David Nilsson, 2 historians from the Royal Institute of Technology here in Stockholm. As a member of the reference group, of the expert group, I have been chairing the reference group. The group has followed, assisted, and critically examined the work of Sörlin and Nilsson. It has been a fruitful process where the very knowledgeable members of the group have helped with facts and to soften a few controversial conclusions and statements. Some remain, and one of them, most controversial, is that, and we'll discuss that wealth is becoming a bigger problem than poverty. Of course, we discussed that. Now, it will be a pleasure to hear the author's presentation of their report. It is an independent piece of work that I hope will both inspire and provoke a new interest and debate on research cooperation for development, and help us to line up for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Arne Biksten, also a member of the expert group, has chaired the reference group of the Fellesson study. Arne himself, as a professor of economics in Gothenburg, has been directly involved in the sandwich programs for PhD training. He can probably count many alumnus among his former students, but perhaps not Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who has just been appointed Director General of WHO. We want to congratulate him. He had part of his medical studies in Umeå, north of Sweden, and that was SAREC funded. A key objective for Sweden's support for development research has been capacity building. Our two reports today deal with that issue from different perspectives. What could be a better match than taking the opportunity to open this seminar with a presentation of how capacity issues are assessed and analyzed in Africa? I have recently left the executive board of the Africa Capacity Building Foundation. They publish a report on different capacity issues every year, and the most recent happens to deal with research capacity in Africa. So I am very pleased that the Executive Secretary of ACBF, Emmanuel Nnadozie, could come to Stockholm and to make a presentation here today. You are very welcome, and you are welcome with your team, Thomas Mutali, and also patience. No, Nkube. It wasn't Nkube. It was. Pardon? Jacob. Please go ahead, and you are welcome to the stage. Then later it will be. I will come back to that. Please, you are welcome, Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie.
Is he okay? Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Gun-Britt. Good morning, everybody. Good morning? That's much better. And now I'm sure you're awake. Actually, I am very happy to be here. I'm very pleased and very honored as well. This being my first time of being in Sweden. I've been everywhere else in the Scandinavia except for Sweden, which is actually strange. This is a place I should have been many, many times for obvious reasons. Sweden being one of the founding members of the African Capacity Building Foundation in 1991. So I'm extremely grateful to Gun-Britt, who served very honorably at our board of executive board, as well as all the other Swedish nationals who have contributed a lot. Now, time is of essence, so I'm going to delve directly into the subject matter and talk about capacity for research in Africa. There are a few constants that I'll make at the beginning to just basically talk about a lot of progress has been made. There's a lot of bad news about Africa, so I don't think I need to join to contribute to that. I'm always thinking about what is positive, but given the audience here today, I think I have to be a bit more balanced and truthful about the real situation. And what is that real situation? It is that even though there's a lot of progress made in building capacity, human capacity, institutional capacity, and other forms of capacity in the continent, there are still some serious deficiencies. And in particular, when it comes to research capacity, the situation is really serious. It is really troubling. And one thing is that the adoption of this Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the AU Agenda 2063, does present a very good opportunity for us to really address this problem in a much more sustainable and a much more significant way. So we at the ACBF have done our best in the past 26 years, and we know we have made significant contributions, but we know that everybody still have more work to do, including the governments as well as the development partners, and this is where Sweden comes into the picture. So the issue then is, if I can get this to move. Next, okay. What is the next here? Yeah, okay. Oh, that's good, thank you very much. Why do I say that the situation is serious? Let's look at the overall picture when it comes to research capacity, proxied by the publications that come out from every region in the world. You can see that close to the horizontal axis is the sub-Saharan African, growth in sub-Saharan African scientific publications, which has remained practically flat over time. So it is stagnant, and that's the major issue. And in comparison to other regions as well, to show you that everyone else is growing significantly, but that of sub-Saharan Africa remains a challenge. So overall, the number of articles for African compared to regions just demonstrate that there's a very low pace of increase in the continent. And in particular, in the science and technology and engineering and mathematics area, that's even where you have a major yawning gap. For example, we know that in in other areas, in countries such as Malaysia and Vietnam, you'd have about 68% on the average in STEM research. But for Africa, this is about 29%. And not only that, but the achievement is dominated by just a handful of countries: Algeria, Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. One other issue is that if you look at what is happening in terms of the collaborative efforts, you would see that that is really where there's a much more contribution happening. That is to say, an excessive reliance on overseas collaboration and visiting academics. So much so that 40 to 80% of science and technology innovation publications are with external partners. Of course, there's nothing really wrong with that, but as long as we see that there's going to be some sort of indigenous potential that is developing, and that ultimately you see much more coming from indigenous institutions. But one more thing is that there's a concentration in the health and agriculture areas. And what is also stunning is that you look at science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which is essential for achievement of the SDGs, as well as Africa's transformation. We see that there are serious gaps in research. The last point I'll make here is that inter-Africa collaboration is just very, very minimal, so that you don't even see that kind of cross-fertilization within the continent itself. But why has research capacity remained so low? Of course, there are so many reasons that one can give. But again, I want to emphasize that there has been a lot that's been done. Sweden in particular has made a lot of contribution, recognizable contribution in this regard. So that should never be minimized. But we will see that if you look carefully at what has happened, I will still argue that even though African countries have gotten independence 50 years, it's been 50 years since they got independence, but you see that some of the legacies are still there. I'm not an apologist or someone who likes to blame everything on colonialism, but the reality is that there were some patterns that are established that are still there. First of all, being the low level or non-existent of research capacity at independence, and you see a graph that will show the increase in the number of universities. But also the legacy in terms of whether emphasis is placed on that or not. And beyond that, in the 70s and 80s, we saw a phenomenon that also wasn't the issue, the problem, which is the excessive emphasis on primary education, following the MDGs and all the research coming out to say Africa should not waste its resources on tertiary education, secondary education, that primary education is where the emphasis would be. Many countries spend huge sums of their resources in primary education, which is fine because it has some benefits, multiplier effects in the economy. But the point is that it should not have been at the detriment of tertiary education or the complete abandonment of tertiary education funding. So that was a major issue, that any progress that was made when some of us were in the universities was ultimately lost. And those universities have to start all over again in the 90s and the 2000s to see how they can rebuild this kind of capacity that has been lost. But look at another dimension where there has been tremendous increase over the years in the number of universities in the continent. Because you can see, for example, in the 2000s, there was just a huge jump in the number of universities. And one would say, of course, before 1960, you can see that there was really nothing. A country like Nigeria had only one university in 1960 when it got independence from Britain. It was actually a university college that was linked to the University of Cambridge. Then it started and has over nearly 200 universities today. But of course, one would say this tremendous and exponential increase in universities ought to show some positive correlation with increasing research and research capacity and research output. But I can argue that given the graph that you saw before, you would see that there's a paradox here. There's a serious growth in the university numbers, but a stagnating amount of research output. So this is a dilemma that we have to resolve. Why is that? I speculate on a few things, that there's inadequate policy support, which could be linked to lack of understanding of the fundamental need for promoting both training and research at the same time. There could be, there is really, really inadequate infrastructure. And even some of the capacity built in terms of human skills are lost through brain drain and through migration. There's also low support. The grant envelope is quite insignificant in any African countries, maybe except for South Africa, if you look at, in comparison, what is happening everywhere. And every researcher here knows that without research grants, you probably wouldn't be able to do any research at all, or without linkage with the private sector and other funding sources. So inadequate funding is also an issue. But there are issues that we need to worry about in spite of some of the good news that I mentioned before. As the premier capacity building organization in the continent, we have been observing that even though there is a lot of goodwill and intention, especially from the point of view of partnerships and collaboration, now we begin to see that there are still a lot of issues that still remain, maybe not as much with the Swedish support, but with many other partners, including the multilaterals, by the way, whether it's the World Bank or the rest of them, that the issue of this unequal partnership that could lead to exploitative partnerships or arrangements, or that could actually create, without creating the necessary trade-offs as to what African countries need. In other words, whether it is policy-oriented, problem-solving, research that has some relevance to dealing with issues versus some of the other research kinds of that are theoretical or more esoteric that are not necessarily what would really to have some positive impact. So there are also issues about modus operandi, how to operate. Everybody is building capacity. Some of them would do a workshop or two, and it will be highly broadcast everywhere in the world. And if you're in the capacity building business, it's not just one workshop. It is a long-term process. It takes a while, for it to happen. I'm told that time is of essence. So, but let me hammer one of the major issues. To me, is the funding issue. Now, we've been talking in general that funding is low, but let me show you some pictures here. Number one is if you look at spending on capacity development on the continent, both by African governments and their partners, we see that there is some decline, and that is not good news at all, when you should see steady increase. And this ACR means the African Capacity Report, which is our flagship report, each year monitoring what is happening in terms of capacity indices, as well as the support to capacity. And you can see that whether it is the ODA that is coming or from the government themselves, that from 2014 there's a decline. But if we use ACBF, which is the premier capacity building organization of the continent, how has our funding been? You'd see that beyond, these are our 5-year programs that are normally supported by African countries, bilaterals, multilaterals, and others. Beyond phase 2, from 1998 to 2000, the gap has significantly increased. That is, when you compare what is expected or what the foundation agreed upon and what ultimately it was able to mobilize and spend in capacity development, you see that this is a troubling. So there's a problem of inadequacy of funding, there's a problem of unpredictability of funding, and there's also a serious problem of unsustainability of funding of capacity development. So those three things combined shows you that the picture is not as rosy as it should be. This is something that is preaching to the choir. Everybody knows what has been said could help in remedying the problem. And a lot of them from the Essence, for example, Essence good practices in capacity development, I just basically throw that out. So I won't go into this, and especially if time is of essence. But what we are proposing from the African Capacity Building Foundation is that we will need to relook at the way we are approaching this problem. Number one is that we have to pay attention to some of the latest developments in capacity development. In other words, this can benefit the research capacity building going forward. And these are issues related to being multidimensional and focusing on system performance rather than just simply one dimension or unidimensional, multi-level, multi-stakeholder, and multi-year programs. Looking at a regional approach, this is an important thing. If you have 54 African countries and you want to support them, which one do you choose, which ones we don't choose? It's going to be overwhelming. So we at ACBF, what we have done is, instead of having 54 programs, we have 5 programs in the 5 geographic regions, drawing from some of the regions in target institutions. There's also the need to work with existing institutions instead of always thinking about building new ones and paying attention to dynamic issues. But more importantly, is that emphasis has always been put on skills or research capacity of individuals and infrastructure. But there are soft capacity issues which are very, very much important. The work that we have done for Agenda 2063 has shown us that issues related to leadership, mindset change, values, and so on and so forth are actually more fundamental than just basically the skills that you improve or put in place organizational functioning mechanisms. So paying attention to that as well as political economy issues is very important. And the ownership and leadership, obviously, is also important. But one important area, and I would advise anybody who's in this business, is that it's time for us to not pay attention simply on building human capacity, but on retaining this capacity and making sure that they are fully utilized. This information is available for anybody who wants it, because I'm being looked at by the timekeeper here that it's time for me to move to wrap up my presentation, and I will wrap it up by just simply saying that for our own response is in these 4 pillars, which anybody who is interested can look at, following this presentation, and how we want to do things. And these are our own lines of delivery mechanisms that range from mobilizing resources to giving capacity delivery services. And these are the areas where we have had some successes and some achievements so far, directly and indirectly in supporting research capacity development on the continent. And finally, we see that there is a very significant opportunity for Swedish partnership with African countries. Because if you look at the priority areas of Swedish Research Aid and match them with Agenda 2063, you see right away that there's such congruence and such agreement in many areas, in many respects, that there is really scope and opportunity for mutually benefiting partnerships to occur. Overall, this is, do I have a timekeeper to sum up, to do my overall? I do. Thank you very much. Okay, there is a severe research capacity deficit in the continent, and this is something that we must deal with. We believe that universities are at the core of the research delivery, and they must be supported. And we believe that SDGs will provide a unique opportunity for rethinking research capacity development, and that they can help drive innovations in research capacity and development and rebuilding research capacity for innovation. And ACBF stands ready to partner with anybody who is interested in this dimension. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Gun-Britt. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for covering a sort of a very full presentation in time. If you kept your time, but as we can see, there were lots of ideas and information in your slides, and I'm sure they will be available. They are available, and the team will also make a presentation of the report at IDEA tomorrow. Maybe some of you will be there, because IDEA is one of your collaborating partners in Africa. But thank you for this, and you will have the chance to comment the reports. You have already, I think, hinted at them here in your presentation, but you will have a chance to comment them in the panel later on. Thank you. And now it's time for Gabriella Ahlström to take over. She will be our moderator today. I think you might know her. She's a journalist, she's an author, and you also hear her now and then on the Swedish radio inquiring about what's up in our time, in spaning. She's a spanare. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gun-Britt, for that kind introduction, and welcome to all of you. I'm very honored for the opportunity to moderate this seminar here today. Before starting, let me brief you on today's agenda. First, we're going to listen to the presentations of the 2 reports, followed by comments and reflections. After that, coffee is going to be served around 10 to 11. And finally, as Gun-Britt said, we're going to conclude this seminar with a discussion with 3 authors and Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie. And thank you so much, Professor, for that very interesting first lecture. And during the discussion, we will also be joined by representatives from Sida and from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Education and Research. But there is not only great knowledge on the stage today, but also here among the audience. You who are here represent universities, embassies, the research policy sector, the aid sector, and different civil society organizations. Prove that the theme that we are discussing today involves and engages many sectors. And during the final discussion, there will, of course, be opportunities for you to questions from the audience as well. So, once again, welcome, and I wish you all a fulfilling 3 hours that I'm sure will shed lights on most of the important challenges and possibilities for the future. And now it's time for the first report, which was introduced by Gun-Britt before. And let's welcome Måns Fellesson.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Måns Fellesson, and just a clarification on the REMESO thing. This is a research institute on migration, ethnicity, and society at Linköping University, where I'm an affiliated researcher. Thank you for having this opportunity to present this report. I would like to start by complimenting Emmanuel and the team behind the RSC report, which I find very useful. It was not ready when I made my study, but I was able to have some pre-launches from it. So, I would say it's a very useful and relevant report covering a huge span of challenges and information that I think it's very up to date. So, I see a great supplementary between this report and the report that I have been done. So you are bringing the macro level, and I try to bring some kind of a micro level at these three countries. We have a limited time. I will try to rush you through this report. So I will go straight to the point and present the objective and methodology of this report. This report is about Ph.D. graduates in Mozambique, Tanzania, and Ethiopia that has been subject for development aid support from Sweden, targeting capacity building in these countries. We look at 3 areas of investigation in this regard, and these are areas that we find relevant and important when it comes to not least capacity building, but also premises in international international research or scientific regime. We look at mobility. On the one hand, vertical mobility, how academics or the PhD grades are moving within the academic system, climbing the academic ladder, so to say, and at what positions they are. We look at sectorial mobility, how and to what extent the PhD graduates could be found in other sectors of society outside academia, and to what extent they have remained in academia. We look at international mobility, stays and positions abroad after graduation. The second component or variable is international collaboration. And here we look at the magnitude and modes of international cooperation in general. How and what kind of collaboration these PhD graduates have. An important part of this is also to look at the relational conditions when it comes to being engaged in these research collaborations. I will come back to that, and I think that is maybe something that could be part of the discussion here also, to see how equal are these research partnerships in reality, and what is the position of African researchers when it comes to these international collaboration. We also look at scientific production, magnitude and modes of publication, and part of this scientific production is also the conditions for research. And here we are particularly looking at funding that Emmanuel brought up, this very problematic area, I will say, access to funding, and intimately linked to that is, of course, and also to the problem of massification, or the increase in institution and students, the problem of time factor to conduct research. So these are the three main areas of investigation. To understand the results of these three areas of investigation, we need to frame them within context, and therefore we spend some time to present and analyze the international science regime and the prerequisites and conditions of that. We also look at the national developments within the three countries to get an idea of what kind of environment these PhD graduates are navigating within. Of course, Swedish development aid policy on research or to research is, of course, a main target of this study. How is this research policy working in these different environments, and how does it relate to the three dimensions of investigation? Just a short word on the method. We used a mixed method approach. It means that we use a web-based survey to cover statistics and so on. We have also used semi-structured interviews with the PhD. We are covering a time period from 1990 to 2014. The data set comprises 243 individuals. The total data set is over 400 individuals. So I will say that the response rate is quite high in this project. And as you can see, it's a quite even distribution between the countries when it comes to response rate. And we target the national universities in these three countries that has been subject for the support from Sida. So, just a few words on the development aid policy context. If you read the current strategy on research, it says it should strengthen research of high quality and of relevance to poverty reduction and sustainable development. That is the overall goal. If you look specifically on the bilateral support, the capacity building for research to low-income countries, the goal is that more partner countries have capacity to independently undertake research training and conduct high-quality research. This is a very important goal, and I think we should have it in mind when we look at the results of this study. The support in general, the support to research, the Sida's research has a long tradition and a long history. And it has been based on a comprehensive and integrational understanding of national research system. And what does it mean? It means that you have to understand a research system comprises of different kind of functions to be able to be functional, so to say. You need, of course, universities that have the administrative capacity, that has the laboratories, that has the libraries, that have the ICT, the interconnectivity functions, and so on. And, of course, you need trained and qualified human resource, PhDs. You also need, as part of this package, functioning research councils. You need policy frameworks on government and on university level. So it's a whole package that has been subject for the Swedish support for a long time. And I think over the years, this has been, Sweden and Sida has been quite alone in pursuing this comprehensive view. There are changes on the way. I think maybe my colleagues from Sida could update you on other donors that are now looking at Sweden as an example and so on. And I would like to, of course, the main target of this study is research training, and that is a central component. If we have no qualified researchers, there will be definitely no research done at these universities. So why are we doing this study? A number of rationales. First of all, the long-term support to PhD training. In these countries, Sida has supported PhD training for around 35 years, which is a very long period. It has also been a support that has been quite unchanged when it comes to the modality, and we are talking about the sandwich model and so on. It has also been a quite unchanged constellation of partnership between institutions in these countries and Swedish institutions and also South African institutions in the case of Mozambique. A considerable number of PhDs has been trained within these three countries. There is no exact number. We have if we count the numbers or the PhDs within the frame of 1990 to 2014, we estimate it to be around 800 to 1,000 individuals. And then, of course, there is a lot of also from the 80s and also from the 70s. So there is quite a substantial amount of PhD graduates trained within this frame. There's also changing surrounding conditions, and I will come back to that when we look at the conditions of the research, the scientific regime, and the national development. And here we are talking about massification, privatization, commodification of higher education and research in Africa. We are talking also about changing premises in the global science regime that affects these PhD trainings, career development. Emmanuel touched upon the 2030 agenda, which is very relevant. Maybe I should put it on the top. This is also a comprehensive agenda, which suggests that we should work in a holistic manner with the 17 goals. We have a specific goal, Goal 17, which is about global partnership that coincides very well with research capacity development and cooperation within research. And you can also find very close links to research in most I would say in all of the different development goals. And there is also very few studies conducted on this in an African context. A lot of studies is done in a European context and in a US context, which has been informed by not least government to understand the mobility and scientific collaboration, citation, and so on of the researchers in the region, in the countries. But from an African perspective, there are very few studies conducted on PhD level, I will say. And lastly, not on this slide, is of course that the research, the support to research training is a very sensitive kind of support. I mean, I don't think you can find any contribution in Swedish development aid that puts so much money into one single individual as the research as the support to PhD training. And this is, I mean, we need to know more about this, because we need also to meet voices that thinks that, okay, maybe how many primary school students or master students can you have for the sum of one PhD trained, and what is the added value of having PhD training? So to meet those voices, I think we need to know more about what these PhD graduates are doing and where they are. Just a few words on the global premises of the science regime. We can see, at least policy-wise, that one is talking a lot about the competitive rationale of investing in science and technology. This, I mean, looking at most of the policy frameworks from OECD countries, but also from African countries, you can see that there is a very strong link between science and economic development and economic growth. So, and this has been also quite emphasized in the Swedish policy context, where you link the economic rationale to scientific production. There's a number of ways also to look at how you succeed internationally, rankings between universities, citations, and so on. Internationalization, we have spent quite some time in this report analyzing the policy framework of internationalization. And I think that could be something that we can discuss later on. But I will argue that the whole package, or the whole of the support, so to say, to the Sida support, contains very strong elements of internationalization. We're talking about mobility, we're talking about collaboration, which are our main components when we are talking about internationalization. Emmanuel gave us a picture of the capacity situation in Africa. We know that Africa is a very small provider of scientific work in general. Most countries belong to the periphery of global networks. But there is also high mobility among African researchers. That is shown by a quite recent World Bank study on regional basis. There are also few regional collaborations, which is to some extent countered by the results of this study, which show that their PhD students have a lot of regional collaboration with African partners. But we'll come back to that later on. There is also, I mean, the government amount in terms of JARD cross domestic expenditure on research and development is very low in most African countries. When we are talking about research capacity in terms of PhD graduates, we can see that African researchers stand for about 1% of the global total amount of researchers in the world. 57 researchers per million inhabitants in sub-Saharan Africa. And this should be compared to the figure in OECD countries, which is about 3,500 per million inhabitant. Brain drain is a problem, of course. 1 of every 9 persons with tertiary education live in OECD countries, and then we are talking about not just Ph.D. trained, but also with any kind of tertiary education. Just a few words on the national context. Screening through the policy on higher education and research in the 3 countries, we can see that there are very high policy aspirations on this. The governments want to invest and see that there is a great importance of having this kind of a knowledge, because all the 3 countries are talking about becoming knowledge societies, knowledge countries, and so on. And they are working along the same rationale of competition, the global competition. To be able to succeed in that, you need to have qualified and functioning institutions in the country. We see, as you showed, Emmanuel, a huge expansion of institution and students. So there is a great priority to higher education. And the question that I will come back to is, of course, how does this massification in institutions and students affect the conditions and ability to conduct research? Oh, Jesus, there's short time left there. There is also low investments, government investment, and aid dependency, of course, when it comes to, especially when it comes to the research part. If we look at the results shortly, we can see that the great majority of the PhD graduates in all 3 countries have remained in the country, which is a very positive result for development aid, actually. We can see that there is a bit lower figure on the Ethiopian side, and then we are specifically talking about graduates in medicine in Ethiopia, which has taken up position in UK and the US to a larger extent. We see also a low stands out situation, and this is particularly true when it comes to medicine, technology, science, agriculture science. Social science and humanities were not that much involved. You can see the figures in the report on that. Another important aspect of this is about the relational order when it comes to conducting these international collaboration. Our interviews revealed a quite daunting picture, I will say, on unequal partnership premises. And it's about controlling the resources in terms of funding. It's about controlling the research agenda. It's about how to carry out the research. It's about roles in empirical in empirical work, and it's about who's on the top of the publication list when it comes to articles and so on, what's in that rank. So here, African researchers lose out to a great extent, I will say, which is a quite big challenge. About the ability to do research. Here I mentioned the time factor and the funding factor. You can see that these figures are 94, 93, and 96, that they spent 25% or less of their time on research. I don't know if we can compare that to figures for Swedish researcher. I don't have that, but it seems like it's a quite small amount of time that they are devoted to research. And we couldn't find any significant variation between disciplines and countries in this regard. And this is a self-estimation, of course, of time. A publication, we didn't do a bibliometric study or citation analysis. I think that this has to be done to understand the scientific output. But we looked at and it was also that PhD graduates had to state to what extent they have published in international journals and national journals. And here we can see that international journals were more frequent in the STEM sciences, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So compared to social science and humanities. Publication in national journals were more common in social science, humanities, and agriculture science. And this has to do with of course, this links also to the figures of international collaboration. Are you involved in international collaboration? There's a tendency that you publish in international journals to a larger extent than if you are not. So this is the end and policy recommendation. And I think maybe I keep this slide up for the discussion. So I don't go through this at this time. I think it will be covered in the discussion in the panel and also with your comments on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Måns. So interesting and a lot of topics for the upcoming discussion. But now let me introduce Göran Tomson. You're going to have a discussion together. Göran is Senior Professor at International Health System Research at Karolinska Institutet. His research and policy work focuses on universal health coverage and has been conducted in countries such as China, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. Among many other commitments, he is also senior advisor at SITE, which is the Swedish Institute for Global Health Transformation at the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. And SITE's objective is to provide a scientific basis for policy work in the field of global health. So the floor is yours for a further discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here on this very important topic, and sorry to have to leave before the end of the session. Now, a couple of things. I want to reveal my bias. So I'm, in addition to what the chair mentioned, I have a health perspective, and I'm responsible for 30 of these around 1,000 PhDs. So I've been working together, supervising and learning together with a number of students from Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia mainly. And please note that I use the term learning together. This work that I have enjoyed reading, it's well written and it has a lot of facts, but there are a couple of things that I miss. And one is the term reciprocal learning. You know, supervision, if it's a good partnership, you learn together. And this is, I think, very much relevant and related to one of the recommendations. Let me see. Måns, you are the author of this, so you know it better than me. But I want to be forward-looking. I'm going to deal a little bit with the past also, because I lack that also in this good report. But mainly forward-looking. And in addition to the term reciprocal learning, and I think I'll start with the first question to you, and we will have a discussion on I didn't want to comment in a monologue, so I wanted to have a discourse. The title is The New Research Capacity in the New Global Development Agenda. what do you mean by the new global development agenda, and how does that translate into your report?
Okay. Yes, the new global development agenda is actually several development agendas. Of course, I mean, on the top of this, you have the 2030 agenda and the development goals, which I will see it's a new comprehensive agenda for development in the world. And I've been studying this agenda, and I see that research capacity and the need and the need for knowledge, innovation, and technology, and so on, are very clear in all of the goals. If we should succeed in any goal, in any of the goals, you need to have that. You also have the issue of resources, because development aid and also
I'm supposed to be, and I've been given the responsibility also to chair this session, right? Okay. And I'm going to be tough.
Yeah.
And I have that reputation. But I'm kind and benevolent. And remember, I started off by commending you for doing this work. Huh? But I want, you know, a truly interactive and not too long answers. Actually, what you could have done in your report would be to relate to much more specifically the different targets. For example, 17.6, 17.9, 17.16, 17.18, 17.19. Extremely relevant targets in the Sustainable Development Goals, relating specifically to some of your recommendations. I don't know, Gun-Britt, whether it is possible to add on a few things into the report, or maybe you can have a sheet, because then you would make this a little bit more futuristic and to the point of the title. Let me ask you another thing. Sweden, you just briefly touched upon it. Gun-Britt knows this. Sweden has been a role model when it comes to research capacity building. SAREC has been mentioned, is being mentioned still as a role model, and you alluded to that in your presentation. There is not much mention, I don't think, anywhere in your report about SAREC. Why is that?
You mean the term SAREC? Maybe not, but I think I referred to the Swedish development aid to research in general, and that also includes SAREC, of course. And I think that I do give a great compliment to the Swedish approach in the report, and I particularly state also in the recommendation that it seems like time has caught up with the Swedish approach to research capacity building.
Excellent.
And then, yeah. Then we are talking about once again connecting to the global goals, and we are also talking about connecting to this specific agenda of resource mobilization, that is the Addis Ababa Action Agenda.
Now you're talking, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
But it shouldn't be forgotten, huh? No. This is a potential export product. I mean, one of the things that have been, that you're not having because it's not part of your sample, and of course the sampling has consequences, but one of the success stories of research training and Swedish capacity building is the Karolinska Institutet Makerere collaboration, which actually Katri was very much responsible for, which built on not only the individual sandwich model, but also, and I don't know whether you got that paper, I was late in sending it. If we look at, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on that, if you look at how the support ideally could be developed from the individual to something more. If you read that paper, maybe you'd like to comment it briefly?
Yeah, I can. I mean, as you said, the Makerere and Koei collaboration is very much a school example of a functional, by the book collaboration, so to say. And there, I mean, within this collaboration, you have managed to go from a quite weak capacity to a quite strong capacity, where you have I mean, set up local Ph.D. programs and so on over the years. So I think that there is much to learn from successful stories, and it goes. I mean, and there are several dimensions to learn about.
Absolutely.
This. It's about the conditions at place. Yeah. I mean, the starting point. Yeah. And it's about the engagement and the setup of the Swedish partner also, and the long-term commitment.
Absolutely.
Of this, because
long-term commitment, good leadership on both sides, and an understanding that there is reciprocal learning. I mean, in the new universality global development agenda, it's not one way, huh? Oh. And it should be understood that this is good for Swedish universities too. Oh. One of the things I liked best in your report was how you suggest that one should break the silos between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Higher Education, and to look into the needs for universities to be better internationalized. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we look specifically on the internationalization policy framework, so to say. And here we can, I mean, if we look at the policy documents from when it comes to both higher education and research within the policy area of education, we can see that there is not much about this kind of collaboration, though it involves a very strong partnership with Swedish institutions over the years. You have seen a considerable number of PhD graduates at Swedish universities over the years. So I mean, these African researchers and research from Asia and Latin America has been around for many years at Swedish universities, and still they are not part of the rationales for internationalization, at least policy-wise. I know that universities, individual universities are working very extensively on this matter, to include also, for example, I mean, researchers and students coming from low-income countries. But if you look on the policy side, there should be, I mean, especially if you see how the PhD, the sandwich model is built, it comprises all components of internationalization.
Absolutely.
Collaboration, mobility, partnership.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So for me, I'm a bit puzzled about why don't we find this important component of I mean, the Swedish development aid in internationalization policies and in research policies. We have a newly decided government policy on research, which is a 10-year perspective. And to my knowledge, and I may be corrected on this, I cannot find any reference to the development aid, to research, and the relevance of having African students at universities in Sweden. And it's also about, I mean, once again going back to the Agenda 2030 and the development goals. I mean, they are comprising global challenges.
Absolutely.
And global challenges must be solved in partnerships. So
absolutely.
And most of these global challenges are affecting African countries the most. And there are a lot of knowledge at universities among individuals in Africa that could be nourished into the Swedish internationalization and knowledge development also, policy-wise.
Do you see any potential for facilitating funding from what is development assistance money for research that is not now being used for it?
From development?
You talk about development assistance. You talked before about the need for more money. So do you see any possibilities to...
Yeah, I mean, we have seen examples where councils are pooling resources for research, but not when it comes to the support of capacity building in Africa. And I mean, I think one thing is about the support of Ph.D. training, to train, but I will say, and that is this is the challenge for all individuals that go through training. The challenging period will come after you graduate.
Absolutely, and that you have clarified very, very well in your report, I think.
So
it's the postdoc period, and here Sida showed that they had understood it. So in the continuation, in the collaboration between Sweden and Uganda, postdocs are being emphasized and trained. I was thinking a little bit about opportunities to embed research in program development and implementation. Embedding, I mean, modern terminology includes this word more and more. Embedding research in program development. There are lots of money available, and there are also lots of requests as part of Agenda 2030 for countries to monitor for accountability, etc. So that would be one element that I would consider. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea. I mean, it was a very common thread all through the interviews that we had. Respondents constantly came back to the issue of postdoc financing. And postdoc to have the opportunity to become mobile, to connect to other research environments, to be able to jointly write applications and so on. There are so many benefits of having these postdoc funds for the continuous elsewhere. But it's also about, I'm suggesting also a separate program when it comes to deal with this power relation.
Yeah.
And that is about setting aside a proportion that could only be applied by African researchers. And here I'm very keen on the response on that. If that is something that could be doable and that could say, because
we have at least one person in the audience, Arne Bigsten, who is part of the... Are you still part of that development research committee? I used to be in it. Arne, are you still part of it? You're out also. It's an interesting idea, and I think the more concrete ideas and suggestions one could have from the work that you've been doing, the better. So that's why I'd like to ask you about some of your recommendations. But before that, what surprised you the most in the results? Was there anything that really surprised you?
Not much, actually. I've been working with research collaborations in Ethiopia and also in Uganda and Tanzania. So I had a fairly good picture of the conditions and so on. But I will say, coming back to this issue of unequal partnership and the feelings that, if you ask the respondents in this web-based survey that we did, it was all about compliments, and it's great to have collaboration and so on and so forth. But when you scratch the surface and asked about, okay, what is your role in this collaboration, and what do you feel about that role? It came up that, after so many years, still many of the researchers had an inferior position when it comes to many aspects of the research. And one important aspect of that is the control of funding.
Absolutely.
Because
sorry. Now, I think one of the other take-home messages, which I find very important from this report, is that you see a potential for Sweden to have a leading position, right? And then as partnership, and I mean, there can't be equal partnership, could it? I mean, it's something in theory, but we have to be a little bit honest. Otherwise, not much of true partnerships. But do you see an opportunity to move this a little bit? This whole area of capacity building? If Sweden is going to take a lead in this, would you agree that this reciprocity, combining internationalization and capacity building in low-income countries, would be one way forward? Would that be reasonable? Secondly, then, if you want to improve partnership, could Sweden do something here? Do we still have social capital enough globally? Do you think so?
Yes, I mean, there's little that talks against the Swedish model at the moment when it comes to both looking at the premises of the 2030 agenda, but then also I would like to emphasize this, coming back to the resource mobilization side and what is stated in, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is about how we should move resources in society towards the sustainable goals. And there you have a separate action area on science, technology, and innovation. And if you read through that, I will say it's a blueprint of the Swedish approach to capacity building. So there is, I mean, we have a lot of international backup when it comes to policy making at the moment. So, and I mean, perhaps Anna-Maria, you can talk about the recent side event that you arranged at the Science and Technology and Innovation Forum 2 weeks ago in New York, where you had, maybe you were there also.
No, I was supposed to, but I couldn't,
okay.
and I was a little bit scolded. We have 1 minute now. Let's see. If there is anything in particular among your recommendations that we haven't touched upon that you'd like us to address. You choose.
Okay. This followed maybe quite naturally on my arguments in general, but I mean, the support to PhD training, I'm suggesting an increase on that when it comes to I mean, of course, I would like to see a total government increase when it comes to research in general, but also maybe a bigger focus on the PhD training component, because as I was showing the number of PhD training.
10 seconds more. I'll get 20 seconds.
Okay. The number of PhD trained persons in Africa is still very, very low. So and we have this situation of massification now of institutions also. So there is a tremendous need for this kind of qualified.
And use then frameworks, not think from the beginning not only on the individual, but the institutional, the networking, the links to evidence impact on policy, and then the globality of it all. Okay, thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Göran.
Samtal.
Yeah, samtal. Thank you.
Thank you both for this rich and inspiring conversation. And thank you, Göran, for mastering this double function as both moderating and commenting. And Måns, you will be joining us for the upcoming discussion. And now let's move on to the next presentation, Research Aid Revisited, historically grounded analysis and future prospects and policy options. And the authors are Sverker Sörlin and David Nilsson, both from Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, KTH, Sverker Sörlin is professor at the Division of History of Science, Technology and Environment, and David Nilsson, researcher, Division for History of Science, Technology and Environment, and director for the Water Center. Please welcome both of you.
Okay, so good morning everyone. We're very happy to be here to present our report today. It's been written, as you heard, by Sverker Sörlin and myself. It's quite a long report. We've got 25 minutes. I'm not going to read through the 100 pages, of course, but we'll try our very best to give you the gist of the report and some of the key ideas that we're trying to present here. So for our presentation here, this is basically the general outline of what we want us to bring up on the table today. We'll just give you a very short introduction. What kind of study is it that we have done? Secondly, I will present a very brief history, like less than 10 minutes history of Swedish Research Aid. And then we'll turn to the changing global landscape. So then Sverker will come in and take the bigger picture, so to say. And to end up with what we think might be possible futures for how to move on with Swedish Research Aid or research collaboration. Right, so what is it that we have done? Well, sometimes it's easier to say what you've not have done, of course, and that's one of the things that we're probably going to get a little bit of criticism about. But what we have done is that we have done a historical study, although we have tried to have a very explicit forward and policy view, and we are, of course, being historians, we are of the distinct opinion that history is actually of some use when you are doing these kind of forward-looking studies as well. But let us point out that it's not an evaluation. We haven't set out to try to evaluate what has been going on in research aid for the past 40 or 50 years. And it's not also an organizational review. Yes, we are trying to pick up some ideas of where this arena, so to say, could move on. But it's not that we have gone back and said, these are the kind of specific organizational changes that we want to see in order to deliver better on the outcomes or so. So just keep that in mind. A few words, I think it's also necessary to say about our method, maybe because being a historical study, it's not very often that you find these kind of historical studies or narratives around development cooperation or specifically about research aid. But we could just say that there has, over the past years, come up a number of these kinds of studies where we are trying to use history to also say something about why we are where we are and to give us some new ideas, some new perspectives on where we could be moving. I just want to point to three studies that have come in the past 5-6 years. So there was one by Thomas Kjellqvist about the Swedish policy around research and innovation. Also, Veronica Brodén-Gyberg has made a study 4 years back, Aiding Science, which also looked at the research aid arena. And last year, Carl Brune also developed or presented his dissertation on the University of Agricultural Sciences and how they had been engaged in research collaboration with countries in the south. And I think that all of the three authors are also here in the room, so you might want to also have a chat with them if you're interested in those particular ones. Okay, of course this is a very useful also information for us when we're trying now to piece together what has been going on in the research aid scene. So a few more things about why we wanted to do this and why EBA wanted to do this. First, we set out to analyze Swedish research aid, and I'll come back to what we mean by that, as an element of development cooperation, but also as an element of research policy from the 1970s and up to now. And we wanted to use the findings of this historical study to review what are the policy options to come up with some reflexive deliberation on how we could move on. Although, having said that, we are not saying that we don't want to come with prescriptions. We want to open up a discussion, more as a primer for an ongoing discussion that we think is a very timely thing to have right now. And why do we say, what do we mean by research aid, and what is this word? Many people probably would rather call it research collaboration, or development research, or research in development cooperation, or things like that. We have chosen to use the word research aid because what we have been studying is a distinct type of activities that have been funded by development aid, but had been classified as, and has a specific separate funding stream all along. So from a definitional point of view, it's become very simple for us to study this particular funding stream. This also means that we have, of course, missed out certain other activities. There has been research and capacity building activities under the development appropriation, under the, so to say, regular development cooperation, which we haven't looked into detail, and that would become maybe a little bit too far-fetched, also requiring too much resources to do that. Just a few words about our method. We have, of course, gone through a lot of literature, and these days, being a historian is becoming, in one way, simpler and simpler because you can find most of these things from your desktop. So if you go to all the public inquiries, the government bills, proposition, government strategies, letters of appropriation, all of these kind of documents have today, most of them have been scanned and you can find them from your computer, which also makes it possible for each one of you to, you can try this at home, you can find these documents online, which makes it also easier for your own, so to say, it's possible to check the facts behind this. So a range of reports and types of documents we've been using. We've also had a few interviews, mostly with former SAREC or present Sida employees. We've used quite a lot of the competence that was in the EBA reference group, but we should also remember that the reference group was just that. It was a reference group where we tried to bounce some ideas back and forth, but the responsibility for the product is entirely our own. And that is the whole idea with the EBA model, so to say. Okay, so I'll just try now to give you a very short history of Swedish Research Aid. And if we had been specifically studying SAREC, for instance, then it would have been rather easy to say it was a story between 1975 and up to 1995, where SAREC was an organizational unit in itself. But it's very important to see the prehistory to this as well. And it goes actually a long way back, we would say. And we've set now on this slide, we're showing the United Nations Conference on Science and Technology in 1963 in Geneva. But of course, there were also activities before that. But we think that is a very important starting point, because that's when states in the, so to say, donor community start talking about introducing a programmatic approach around how to develop research capacity and research and knowledge as a tool to fight poverty, as a tool to deliver development. And then after 95, when SAREC was merged with Sida and a number of other agencies, SAREC, the name actually lived on for a good number of years, until 2008, when it disappeared in one of the organizational changes. And then you could also say that in 2013 is also another important milestone, when the support to the Swedish academic community that was taken from development aid shifted from Sida to Vetenskapsrådet, to the Science Council. So this is just at a glance. Let us just look a little bit more in detail at some of these steps here along the way. So we set out in the report to start talking about what is happening in the aid scene at large in the 60s. Well, we can first of all see that if we start at 1960, Sweden was really a midget, really a very, very small actor on the international aid scene. If you compare to some of the large countries, the US, Great Britain, France, and so on, we were spending much less than any of these countries, around 0.1% of the GDP. And then there was a concerted effort, of course, to bring Sweden up as one of the major international players, and that took off really from the Proposition 1962-100, the so-called Aid Bible. And we saw the formation of Sida in 1965, and there were some research collaboration already at that stage with countries like India and Ethiopia. Some of them had started long before as initiatives from individuals, but there was also a lot of support going to the major international actors like FAO or EPTA, which was the extended program for technical assistance, which was under the United Nations, World Health Organizations. And some of these were fit into the country programming, which Sida was following at the time. Now, there were a lot of these trends now going on in the 60s, as we said, about how to use science and technology to deliver development. So there was this buzz going on in the international scene, and I mentioned the United Nations Conference on Science and Technology in Geneva, and Sweden sent a delegation of some 13 or 14 people, and there were a number of these activities going on. And the Pearson report, which was one of those flagship publications coming out from the World Bank circles, it was published in 1969, and there we can actually see some quite astonishing, some quite radical ideas being put on the table in the end of the 60s around how to use science and technology, science as a, so to say, a vehicle for development. So one of the propositions that came forth in the Pearson report was actually that all rich countries should have as a target that within a few years, actually by 1972, they said, all the rich countries should put aside 5% of their total expenditure, the government expenditure should go to research and development, and half of that would be spent in low-income countries. Now, if you convert that to the present situation in Sweden, it would mean that our research bill would every year be 50 billion Swedish kronor, and of which 25 would actually be spent in low-income countries. So you can see the 60s, as I think that some of the people in the room might even recall, the 60s were, you know, the era of great thinking somehow. So there were no lack of vision at that point. So how was this picked up in Sweden? Well, the formation of SAREC and the institutionalization of research aid in Sweden was, although it was informed by a number of international trends, it was a very Swedish process. In Sweden, we love putting together various committees and working groups and so on. So you can see that the formation of SAREC was basically a string of committees, one by one, for informing the government, taking step by step. So first there was an expert group in 1965 chaired by Bror Rexed, and then there was the Science Council group where Sida was trying to collaborate more with the Swedish Science Councils in 1969. The Development Research Commission, which you can also see the front page of here, which was set up by the Ministry for Education in 1971, delivered its report in 73, and that basically laid the platform for starting up SAREC in 1975. But one should remember that when SAREC started off in 1975, it was not an agency on its own. It was actually part of, or it was co-hosted by Sida at that point. And they didn't get the letter of appropriation to become a fully fledged independent agency until 1979. So there was this number of commissions and committees, and we go through that in the report and trying to see how they were passing the ball in between each other. Because there was something a little bit contentious about this process, which was about creating some separate agency outside of Sida. This is what the U-landsforskningsutredningen, the research aid committee came up with, that they wanted to see a separate agency. Sida was very much against this. A number of other organizations were against this. But the problem was, as we have found it in the source material, was that it was found that without having a separate agency with a separate funding, there could not be enough of this development. There could not be enough of the research aid because there wasn't enough demand for it in low-income countries at the time. And as we heard also from Emmanuel in the beginning, it's still a bit of a problem with having that kind of priority for a low-income or middle-income country to start investing in research. And why was it therefore necessary to have SAREC as an independent agency? Well, it was because Sida had to follow the country programming, and the country programming was very much determined by the cooperation country governments. So demand was not much. So basically you can look at this as, well, maybe you could say that it was about forming what you should call in innovation talk, you would call it a niche, a protected niche where this format, the forms and the modalities and the instruments could grow without being too much competition. Okay, so the framework was established in the 1980s, and basically three components: bilateral cooperation, as we heard about, global cooperation, support to global research, and research in Sweden. And we go through the financing over the years here. I'll just showing this quickly, that the aid finance, as you can see, it has been growing. The proportion going to research aid has been roughly around 3%. It's going to 2.5 up to 4.8 and then back to 3%. Relatively stable over the years. And also how the share between the different parts have, at least over the past 20 years or so, been relatively stable also, where a little more than half of the money is going to global cooperation. About 30% goes to the bilateral, and 15% or so, 10 to 15% goes to the Swedish community. So there was also some organizational changes, as I mentioned. These four agencies were merged into Sida, the new Sida, in 1995. So that we still had the bilateral cooperation, global and research in Sweden as the three main modalities. In 2013, Science Council took over this research in Sweden. So that has moved since 2013. So just reflecting briefly on change versus continuity, we see that there has been a number of organizational changes. We see that there have been new themes coming in. There has been increased focus on institutional capacity building. And there's new selection routines in how you actually establish partnerships, and more focus on scientific quality as well. But on the other hand, this three-tier framework of global, bilateral, and Swedish support programs has been relatively stable, and also some of the objectives have been rather stable, actually, which very much is about developing capacity to close a knowledge gap, which we think can deliver development. And we think now that perhaps seen in the global changes around Sweden, it is important now to start thinking about how we can rephrase.
Yeah, thank you. Usually when historians gather around you, then people may be nervous because that might be a sign that you may not be part of the current context. But in this case, I can assure you that it was really a commission by the EBA. The chair, Lars Heikensten, approached me 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, and asked me whether I was interested in taking on a work like this. And I said, actually, yes, it would be very interesting. And I think the reason behind this commissioning was that actually we have had too little historical research. This is a fairly new thing, like 50 years ago or so it started, and we are coming into a phase of increasing reflexivity around this, and I think that is very welcome. And memory is also lost. Although some people may still remember the 60s, very much of it is now conducted by people who have very little experience of those days, and they come in much later. We've already heard a little bit about this that is now going on, and increasingly these kinds of broader goals are setting the stage for many things we do, all including, of course, research aid, but certainly not limited to that. Sometimes we rejoice, and sometimes we see problems with this. Some of this is related also to changes in our understanding of the world we live in. The Anthropocene is a concept following on the environment, very important concepts for guiding research and development and also economic development, or should be guiding. Certainly they are not guiding as much as we think they ought to. Also, this is a change in relationships between anything from societies to the human bodies and the living environment that we have. This is conducted by top scientists, but it's also spreading out in institutions, in ways of thinking about the world we live in. It's also concepts that we have, some of those even developed here in Stockholm, around the kind of boundaries and limits for global development. And if we compare this to the 60s, it was around this kind of language, but it has matured and developed a lot since then. One might think that this is a simple progressive road that the world is taking, but it is not. There are certainly many nostalgic and conservative forces that still prohibit us from doing what we would like to do. And I say we, including, I suppose, people in this room, and also progressive forces around the world. But this is still a struggle going on between forces where we may wish to locate both development aid and research aid. This also depends on where you are on the surface of this globe and which kind of national context you are in. The same kinds of resources may mean different things to different people, and how you mobilize these resources and political energies also vary quite a lot. We have some of this in the report, and I will just offer this in by way of a kind of backdrop. Then the question arises very much: what kinds of knowledge interests should guide us? In particular, perhaps, when we think about how to invest the always, per definition, limited funds that we have. And that's, we have not chosen this image of our own university here in Stockholm, the KTH, because we are particularly fond of this place or so. But it is because it is a way of understanding how knowledge interests were formed that are in themselves historical. This is a historical picture, it's from the previous century, and the answer to this question is very much that it is obvious, more or less obvious, what this kind of institution was for. It was directed to provide knowledge for a rising industry in our own country, in Sweden, and that was what was going on. If we just juxtapose this with the same question for our current world, and this may be taken as a sort of a template image for the current world, it is no longer obvious. It is far from obvious what we should do to answer this question: who should do it, where they should be, and how they should collaborate. But we know some of this answer. Some of us have opinions about this. They are well-founded in research. There's lots of work going on, but it is still not so obvious. Among the progressive work that is going on is, for example, this International Panel on Social Progress that has been started by, or initiated, I should say, by Amartya Sen, who's also been very much involved in trying to think about the index of human welfare and development globally. It is modeled very much on the IPCC, with about 300 social science, mostly social science researchers coming together to define this very fundamental concept in our time and day. That is the kind of knowledge we need in order to carve out these forward progressive paths and to answer the questions about knowledge interests. If we look for a brief moment at some of the major leading scientific institutions, they also take these kinds of commands and ideas very seriously. Here is words from MIT President Raphael Reif last year, and similar things I heard from other institutions around the world. There is a goodwill in many institutions to do more and to collaborate. And the leitmotif in all these statements are that collaboration is always necessary across national borders, across many borders, across disciplinary borders. It is always collaboration. It is also, in a very healthy way, spreading from the core areas that we heard about before in science, technology, and medicine, also to the social sciences and the humanities. And here is an example from the International Social Science Council that this is happening. Transformative pathway programs to sustainability are being presented and funded and discussed in these contexts as well. We have a very lively work in many institutions around the world. Here is one example, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK, on transformations and transitions, how to move from the current situation into a more desired future sustainable situation. And some of the, well, these are just examples of key names and players here. To the right, you see Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, who really has very much stated the agenda for state leadership in investment in this area, investment in infrastructures, but also in research. The idea of directionality, that just growth in itself, growth of budgets and growth of the economy isn't enough. We should care very much for directionality in what we do, also by Spruce scholar Andy Sörlin, and the general agenda for transitions research. These people, of course, collaborate. They collaborate with us in Stockholm. They collaborate with people elsewhere in the world. And there's always this balancing issue of national and corporate interests in one country, the old question, with the more universal needs. And these questions don't go away. It was hinted at the very beginning that we have, among our points of interest in the work we've done in this report, is to look at how wealth is then somehow becoming a double-edged sword. Poverty alleviation remains a main and core issue, and it must be taken seriously. We shouldn't stop that work, certainly. But also, wealth production has, over a century, even a couple of centuries, and increasingly become part of the increase of the challenges that the world is facing. And that doesn't go away either. That is actually the very core of the issue with transitions and transformations. And here is a set of the keywords that here come back again to address this kind of issue. Nobody, certainly not myself, would argue that there is something wrong with wealth. We want that. But the question is how. And that speaks very much to the kind of work that Research Aid is doing and trying to do. So the broad brush take-home message from this is that we have had a set of phases or knowledge regimes, as we call them, over the post-World War II period. You could say that basically it was very much national to begin with. Sweden had its particular reasons also for foreign policy and economic policy to work and open up its agenda towards the global south. That was a way of taking a position, along with ideals of solidarity and so on. But since about 10 years, the world is now moving into a post-Lehman Brothers kind of world, a post-crisis world where the financial crisis and the couple of crises of the first decade of this century is now marking the future thinking about both development thinking and research policies and innovation policies. So then, finally, what might this hold in stock for the future of Swedish Research Aid? Well, be a little bit sort of pointing to the bifurcation kind of situation we are in now, that we have to perhaps make some choices. And we have 8 propositions for the kind of conversation we would like to see. We have no strict and clear-cut policy recommendations. That was not part of our remit. We were supposed to do a historical study, which we have done, but we think there are a number of areas where we could and should keep up this conversation. We believe that we have a world now that is no longer just north-south divided. It is a world where the challenges and problems are basically shared. And global challenges are becoming local, and they are becoming local everywhere. They are local in the global north as well as in the local south. And if you couple this with the thinking around wealth as when it is becoming increased, it contributes inadvertently to these challenges. That's yet another level of complexity to this situation. We think that it might be helpful to think about research agendas as something that should be formed more in dialogue. That is already happening, but it could probably be increased. And if you then link this to the way research aid has become shaped in different countries, we have a small international survey in the report of 4 countries, Canada, Norway, Denmark, and which is the 4th country? In the Netherlands? Sweden, actually. Yeah, well, actually, a few countries where we look at and it isn't very encouraging, actually, to look at how other countries are looking at this. Sweden has already been praised here as a model. That may be true, but even Sweden is not the super big player if you look at what else is going on in the world and how, for example, the Asian countries are rising as well as the Latin American countries, for example, funding their own operations in research. So then there is a need to think in perhaps ways that weren't there in the 60s and 70s. Also, the knowledge base is widening. A part already hinted at, part of the kind of research collaborations that are increasingly emerging now is to include all science areas from technology and medicine across to the humanities and the social sciences. We strongly believe that institutions are very essential. It has already been said a couple of times here that the creative energies in all parts of the world about what universities are, what they could be, what they should be, what kind of roles they can play in society, that could certainly be improved. I see people in the room here whom I were working with in the UNESCO in the previous decade about precisely a world where the numbers of universities are growing enormously. We had some numbers on that on the screen a moment ago. But exactly how is this happening? How are investment made in these new institutions and how are they linked? Should they be linked to the kind of challenges we have? Change of scale seems to be required. One core idea in our thinking here is that if you could mobilize other kinds of programs and move the thinking and action around research aid in a more integrative way towards general research and innovation policy, the scale would be increased. In order to do the kinds of things that Måns Fellesson suggested, more money is needed, but there is a limit to how much you can actually allocate under the aid budget. If you think more integratively about how you mobilize resources, we think that might be a way of approaching that conversation, which then would involve more universities and more agencies in Sweden as well. And that is basically the message of point number 8 here. Finally, look at this. There are numbers of reasons precisely now, as we speak, to bring up this topic of research aid. Lots of things are already happening. I've hinted to some. We have a research bill that's very fresh, taken by Parliament only recently, that addresses global challenges, actually, and provides new thinking, long-term, 10 years, of how to do that. That could certainly be a starting point, not a final station in a kind of road forward. We have a revival of the PGU, launched only recently after a few shaky years. We have a firm commitment, at least rhetorically, about the Agenda 2030. Ways of putting these words into action will be needed, and we suppose this research aid is one of the arenas where this could be played out. And last but not least, we have a new Sida General Director coming in, and that might have some new things to think about as we move along. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sverker Sörlin and David Nilsson. And now you will be joined by Helena Lindholm, Deputy President from the University of Gothenburg, for some further comments and a further discussion as well.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to provide some comments to a very good report. I'd like to say also that I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University of Gothenburg, but I'm also Professor of Peace and Development Research, and I feel some kind of nostalgia also when reading the report, because I remember when my professor Björn Hettne were mobilizing the whole department in Gothenburg in applying for research money from SAREC. That was the whole department was involved. Well, first of all, thank you, both of you, for a tremendously good read. I enjoyed reading it a lot, and I think that both research and aid, or research aid, if you like, will benefit from it, from its content. There are in the report a great deal of ideas, perspectives, and information and knowledge that I hope will inform, actually, the agenda to come. And I think also that those ideas are extremely timely delivered, and I think you are very right in that. This is a window of opportunity, if you'd like, to kind of restart a new concept on research aid. So also some praise to the EBA, I think, for commissioning the task of producing this report. You enter, and you have described this also here in the presentation, how the times of globalization and the challenges that we face are truly global, and we therefore need global approaches and new research-based ideas. Agenda 2030 provides us with a completely new and comprehensive platform for contributing to sustainability through research and knowledge. I think perhaps one thing that could also be emphasized is how like development comes in new forms, and I visited Rwanda and Botswana during the spring together with Stint, and it was kind of obvious how both countries and their university leadership emphasized knowledge economies, that they wanted to become knowledge economies as a step in their development processes, and their research will become is an obvious ingredient. I just like to point out some more things that I like with the report, and then I have some questions, and I hope you can engage with me in those in discussing those questions. I really do like the historical perspective, and I really do like how you place aid and research in a political context, and you also point out what kind of instruments research aid might have served politically for Sweden and for other countries. I like how you point out the role of humanities, that perhaps research aid is too often thought of as something that has mostly to do with the hard sciences, technology, medicine, etc. But you point out the role of humanities and of history, and I like that a lot. I also like, and I think there is. I hope this will be discussed a lot, how you conceptualize wealth as a problem. The concepts around that, I think, is thought-provoking. Okay, so here are some questions that I like you to dwell a bit upon. Because I believe that another reason why this report is needed right now has to do with what might be called the reactions against globalization that we are living in. To me, the times we are living in are very much a reactive kind of reactive politics, and part of that is threats and exposure and vulnerability of academia and of research. Academic freedom is being threatened globally in different forms. This is a shared global problem, I would say, but it comes in different forms. We've seen attacks against education, infrastructure, universities in Kenya, Pakistan, etc. Of course, this is not new because we know that education is an important tool for power and for governance, etc. But it is coming in new forms, and it's also spreading in a way to Europe and the West with the Trumpism and the fact resistance. So, how do you see that research aid could kind of maneuver and work and navigate in this context, or is there a particular role for research aid in this context?
Yeah, let me try and start on this. Of course, this is the billion-dollar question. We see how the resistance struggles, so to speak, against this kind of populist and nationalist revolt, sometimes also tainted with strands of religion. There's a mix there. Is being fought, and I already hinted at it. I think there is a need and sort of a possibility for a recontextualization of research aid as well into something that we would like to call a new enlightenment. That actually some of the spirits and spiritual inspiration from the Enlightenment needs to be re-articulated and brought to our own time. And I think it may seem a trivial idea, but I think it's still very important, is the role of progressive and forceful ideas of how to invest and how to bring the states and their leadership and also their investment portfolios to bring to bear on these kinds of challenges. That is a language that I think has political clout, because of course the resistance is easy to understand, that globalization has been a threat to many people. And in that slide where we saw different kinds of people in resource industries, precisely the word you used, nostalgia, is very much part of it. They long back to a world and a situation where the boundaries were not so easily crossed. And that's, of course, part of Trump's policy. So I think it is absolutely mandatory to re-articulate research aid, not as the separate, small kind of thing on the side, but rather as part of something that is much, much bigger, that crosses the borders with a progressive agenda that also brings, and that is, of course, a challenge to really articulate what you can bring to people, both at home and not at home at the same time.
Yeah, and if I could just add something there, I think that you cannot underestimate the size or the gravity of the kind of changes we've been going through for the past 10 years or so. And it's like completely rewriting the geopolitical playing field as well. So if we think about research aid or development cooperation or whatever, which has a long history, which once had its foundations somehow molded in a world which looks so completely different. I mean, what we have seen, if you talk about Trumpism or the threat against academic freedom as a result of the, should I say, nationalization of power, it's also because the entire global power map has changed. And what we have seen, perhaps contradictory in a way, but also an emerging South with, well, not maybe the lowest income countries, but clearly the middle income countries are now much more powerful also in the international scene. So as a reaction to that, some of the rich countries are now pulling back from some of the international arenas. So it's a completely different landscape, and we need another compass perhaps. And that's why we think it's also necessary to start looking for that kind of compass.
Well, I agree, but I think this kind of issue or tendency perhaps needs some further reflection. What role could research aid play in this situation? Another issue which I consider of importance is related to the global refugee situation and how war destroys universities, educational systems, how if we take Syria alone, we have hundreds and thousands of students on the run and young people who are not students yet, but in the age of potentially becoming students. We have thousands of scholars, academics, professors, researchers on the run. And in the sense we have, if we now talk about globalization and how borders are shifting and changing and evaporating, we have like academias in diaspora, in exile. And I wonder whether you have thought about that, if research aid can contribute in that situation. Can we rethink capacity building? Can we think about capacity building in exile, in perhaps rebuilding a fragmented and diverse academic society? Also, we have this situation with more and more scholars who are applying for help through organizations such as Scholars at Risk and the Council for At-Risk Academics, who are also coming to Swedish universities. Can research aid play a role there?
Well, certainly it can. It's just that we have been, as you perhaps remember, we outlined that the trend over the year has been more investing into institutional capacity building. So therefore, we need to think of what other ways can we do more, maybe, I don't know, individual capacity building again. It reverses some of the trends, really, with all this diaspora or the mobility of. So how research aid is going to grapple with that, I don't know. Probably it's also so that we should talk less of research aid and think about how this kind of capacity building, or this, how we can integrate or mobilize the academia that is on the run through other ways. I don't know what kind of cultural collaboration or other types of mechanisms could. So not perhaps think of how can we change research aid as it is now, but think of these people are there. So how can we deal with that?
Yeah, maybe if I could sort of also go back a little bit to the previous report about Ph.D. training. There are some impressive numbers there, 800 to 1,000 Ph.D. students trained in the Swedish program and so on. But at the same time, we educate 3,000 Ph.D.s or licentiates every year in Sweden, and we have done so for the last 20 years, and before that it was 1,500 to 2,000. So we have a population in Sweden only that about 100,000 people that have some kind of graduate training. So even in our own country, these proportions, well, we have to think about them. And then that could be compared to the fact that if we look at the population, it is already quite international. 25–30%. I don't have the precise number. A fairly high portion of the PhD students that are in training, not funded through research aid, are international. So there is already a lot of, it's not just the diaspora, it's also the international collaborative spirit and practice that has always been there with the research community. It is a broad thing going on, enormously broad. And in many countries, the PhD training is even more internationalized than in Sweden. So again, I think one of the leitmotifs that we want to bring into this is that actually, although Sweden has an impressive track record here, it's a very small phenomenon. So if we want to create change in the world, we should look at how to link research aid with broader policy areas. And of course, naturally, research, science policy and innovation policy to begin with, but also other kinds of programs. And exactly how to do that, we have refrained from talking about because that was, again, not our remit, but we believe very strongly that that is where we should be going. And I think that speaks to your question as well, because if we look at refugees, if we look at our academics, if we look at people who are displaced because of harsh policies against universities and academic freedom, it should again be looked at. I think we have a very broad church here that could absorb many more people. But then we have to, of course, to individualize and target activities that can speak to this particular problem. And that was certainly not anything that we did in the report. That's true.
I think though, that this is something that needs to be thought about and considered. Also, if we speak about higher education, less than 1% of the world's refugees have access to higher education. And in terms of long-term development cooperation, it ought to be a good thing to invest in the future kind of reconstruction of Syria and other war-torn societies. I have some other questions, and I'll collapse them into one. Just one issue, one further issue is that I also think that a higher education in its own sense could be emphasized a bit. You do point towards capacity building, Ph.D. training, and sometimes master's education, but higher education is, as one of the presentations also showed, something which is fundamentally lacking in development cooperation strategies for some reason. I don't know why actually, but for some reason. But turning more towards perhaps a bit more instrumental issues, because in your last propositions, the final one, you speak about the mainstreaming and integration of research aid, and I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on how that would potentially look like. You suggest that one could look at how the research bill, how the programs in there are distributed towards the research agencies, and how that would potentially be materialized. Related to that, I also wonder about all the research which is of relevance for development cooperation, but is not funded, was never funded by SAREC, and is not funded by this particular VR funding either, but is of relevance. I mean, so the scope is much broader than indicated in what's funded from there. And I'd also like to ask you to focus a bit on what has also been emphasized in other presentations, that capacity building often leads to research cooperation, but many times on unequal terms. I heard from Rwanda, for example, that research collaboration often meant that Rwandan scholars did the field work and Western scholars presented the results at conferences and made the publications. So could you say something about that?
Well, I think that first of all, if you look at the government's research bill, which came last year, I mean, that was an excellent opportunity where this could have been done already, because it clearly targets some of the global challenges, of course, very much contextualized or understood in the Swedish national sense, how it impacts on our own economy, our own society at large. What one would have liked to see there was also not just the 10 national priority programs, but some of them specifically talking about how to involve researchers, research community in other parts of the world, not just where we normally would go and find them, and that is basically within the EU or maybe US or somewhere, but actually target to really reach out and say, okay, we know that these are the problems we are having. We are facing them together with people in the southern hemisphere. We have already contacts with many of these universities. As we have heard, more than half of the PhD students are keeping up their collaboration with their Swedish counterpart. Why not use that much more within the framework of the government research proposition, for instance? And that has also now direct effect on the funding streams, of course, and it should have, because it should not be, at least not only seen as a protected area for developing capacity in the global south. We need that as well. But what has happened over the past 40 years is that it has become an aid thing. Yeah. And we know too little about what the other things that are happening with financing from foreigners. I mean, I know there's a lot of programs going on where we have collaboration with the Global South, which is not funded under the aid budget. But we know too little about how much is it, how is it governed, and that should be, I mean, we would need some kind of guidance strategy for that.
Yeah, unfortunately we have to quit there, but perhaps you can come back to those issues in the panel later on. Again, thanks a lot for the read, and I really do hope that it will be used and implemented in both research and aid. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, the three of you, Helena, David, and Sverker, and you two will be joining us in the upcoming discussion. I think that you all long for a cup of coffee. Am I right? We are going to pause for a coffee now, and we will continue at 11:15 with a final panel discussion. So we'll come back then. So, welcome back, all of you, to this wrap-up discussion. There is a lot to reflect on. Luckily, we have a highly qualified and skilled panel here. And I would like to start by introducing the panelists, or at least the ones you haven't met yet. Next to me is Anna-Maria Oltorp, head of the Research Cooperation Unit at Sida. Eva Tobisson, Deputy Director at Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And next to Eva is Rolf Höijer, Ph.D. and Senior Advisor at Education and Research. Did I say Ministry of Education and Research? I do that now. And not to mention Sverker Sörlin, Professor Emmanuel Nnadozie, and David Nilsson and Måns Fellesson. And there are, of course, a lot of possible topics for this discussion about the grand challenge era, Sverker Sörlin, as you called it. The overall question might be the road ahead, of course, and how the recommendations and the propositions in these two reports can be realized. We have already had two very interesting discussions, and I think I would like to start with you, Anna-Maria Oltorp. I'm sure we are all very curious to hear Sida's remarks on these two reports.
Thank you. And I want to start by thanking EBA for commissioning these studies and for making it possible to have an extensive discussion on research cooperation within development cooperation. I'm not going to say research aid. It's very much research collaboration that we are talking about. But also to have the discussion about the link to national research policy, or maybe I should say the weak link to national research policy today. I also want to thank the authors of the reports for showing the interest in development research collaboration. From my point of view, I think the discussion on research collaboration has been missing the last years. It has not gained the recognition that it deserves. But I think also these reports come at an ideal time. As has been mentioned, the SDGs emphasizes the need for research to implement the goals. Furthermore, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development highlights the need for science, technology, and innovation and capacity building in one of 7 tasks. And from my point of view, there's no chance that we can successfully implement the SDGs without all countries having access to thriving research communities that understands the local context and that is contributing and engaging with the broader international research arenas. Due to the budget allocation for research cooperation in Sweden over the last 40 years, Sweden has had the possibility to support capacity building in a way that is quite unique. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Swedish model, as we call it later. So capacity building has been a part of research cooperations since the very start, as mentioned. But it doesn't look today as it did in the early days. It has been a learning by doing and quite dramatic changes that I'll come back to. The role of institutions have been emphasized today, as well as the universities as important institutions. But research capacity is much more than research within certain topics or areas. It has to do with a country's ability to form its own development. All countries need researchers that can access and contribute to international research, as well as address local challenges through the generation of new knowledge. And looking at Sörlin and Nilsson's report, in the preface, it reads, supporting increased research capacity by building institutional, individual and infrastructural research capability is probably more important today than ever. Knowledge is the power to change. And I couldn't agree more. And the report also provides an interesting historical account of where we are today. But what I have some difficulties with is following how the authors reach the specific conclusions and propositions based on the early parts of the report. But regardless of that, it's still interesting to look at the different propositions that are stated. So I'll look at those and comment a bit on those. And in doing so, I indirectly also comment partly on Fellesson's report, and then I'll come back and say a few words specifically on his report. The first proposition is challenges and problems are shared. Absolutely. And the universality of the Agenda 2030 certainly highlights this. And again, research is highlighted within this agenda. That was not the case when we talked about the Millennium Development Goals. And this certainly opens up for collaboration way beyond development cooperation. And I think here, national research policy is very important. The challenges we face are many of them are global, and Sweden needs collaboration with researchers from many low-income countries in order to be able to address these SDGs. So it's in our own interest to have that collaboration. Global challenges are local is the second proposition. Absolutely. And this further emphasizes the need for local capacity in all countries to address research, and the need for research collaboration beyond borders to accomplish these goals. The third proposition, wealth is becoming a critical problem. That is a proposition I don't really understand what development cooperation has to do with this specifically. I'd say that's research policy, national research policy, to be handling that. The fourth, research agendas should be formed in dialogue. Absolutely. But that's not the case today. There are an increasing number of international calls, but they exclude research from low-income countries. It excludes researchers from participating in calls because there aren't funds and research councils in these countries that are on board and providing funding. Most national research councils only fund researchers from their own countries. Moreover, researchers from these countries are not part of formulating the calls, which means that it's the perspective of our countries that are focusing in these calls. And this is an important area where research collaboration within Sida also works. We try to work with both regional and global research organizations to make the voice of researchers from the global south more heard. Institutions remain essential. It's the sixth proposition. And universities are mentioned. What Sida does, and what I don't think has been emphasized, is this, to have the systems approach to capacity building. It's not only about funding research or PhDs in sandwich programs. It's about funding the infrastructure for research. It's about funding local research councils, because researchers, once they are back, and we see the great success of having around 95% of the PhDs trained through our program back in their countries, they need to have a research environment from which they can work. Well, I missed the fifth point, and that is the knowledge base is widening, where the authors highlighted humanities and social sciences. And I think from the report this morning by Professor Nnadozie, the STEM areas is where the gap is the largest. So there certainly is some research within the social sciences and humanities. But I do agree, we need to also put emphasis on that and highlighting the importance of social sciences and humanities as we are addressing the global challenges. And one initiative that was also featuring on one of the PowerPoints was the Transformations to Sustainability call that Sida funded fully through the International Social Science Council, where that was calls open from researchers in any country, but there had to be researchers from low and middle income country in the research teams, and hopefully also in leading roles. The specifics of this call was also that it was the lead of the research team was to be from the human and social sciences group, but then these should be transdisciplinary research groups, so inviting other areas to participate. The seventh proposition, change of scale. And certainly we cannot solve the global challenges without collaboration also with the researchers from low-income countries, and we come back to that again. But when it comes to Swedish internationalization, I think research policy has a greater role to take here, and research collaboration within development cooperation can participate, and we can collaborate much more in the future than has been done so far. When it comes to the last proposition, that research aid should be mainstreamed and linked closer to knowledge and research policy at large, I don't really understand what the authors is suggesting and how they came to this conclusion. And I think Helena Lindholm-Schultz also emphasizes and asks for some clarifications, and I think we may want to come back to that. And a question is, you're also talking about the new and wider model for collaboration that you're referring to in the summary. Is this the same thing that you're talking about there? So I would suggest a close collaboration between development cooperation within research collaboration and national research policy, and would very much welcome stronger writings in that. But saying that, I must say that the collaboration with research councils in Sweden, Vinnova, Formas, VR, and Forte, that is working very well. We have quite some collaborations there and discussions. It's referred to the national programs in the research bill. Sida is invited, they're part of the groups advising that work, so that's also really there. Agneta Blad is also here, who is the examiner of the internationalization of higher education and research. And you have really highlighted the interest of looking into how development cooperation is participating in the internationalization. Saying just a few words on Måns' report. The report is based on data from those countries that we work with longest. There are also 3 other countries where we're currently working: Uganda, Rwanda, and Bolivia, which has a shorter period of time in terms of collaboration. And I think Göran Tomson very well mentioned the work in Uganda and the progress there. And we also have a colleague, Raymond from Rwanda, here today in the audience, who can say something about that program. And Måns is mentioning the need for more PhD training on a sandwich model. I'd say yes, that is true. There is certainly a need. What we see more and more, and in the case of Uganda, is that there are more of local PhD programs coming up, and that will cater for more researchers, more PhDs. And that's really the effort that we're taking in these bilateral models, to go towards local PhD trainings. And that's where our support may end. Because when you can then reproduce the next generation of researchers, that is the end of our type of support through the bilateral program, I would say. But also emphasizing that the bilateral programs are all the time changing. The focus has changed and it looks very different depending on the country. It's not the same size, same model fits all. So this is really also a feature that I want to highlight. And Göran Tomson also mentioned that, well, we realized the importance of also the PhDs being able to continue with research and then has provided also support to postdocs and so on. And also supporting innovation systems in these countries. And indirectly, I would say the research collaboration also affects higher education, although that has never been the focus of the training of PhDs. The international mobility and the importance of these researchers to be able to collaborate in international research group is really important and needs to be emphasized much more. There are now good researchers coming up in different countries, maybe not always critical masses, but they need to be able to collaborate, and there need to be calls from Africa where the calls are set there with the priorities in these countries. And that's also why we support quite a number of regional research councils and regional networks, also emphasizing in all these that's been referred to the global support, that we need much more involvement of researchers from the low-income countries. I should also mention that we are now, or Sida is planning an evaluation of the bilateral collaborations for the fall. It's one of, I think, 4 strategic evaluations, so we will get more information on what works and what does not, and how we need to continue to apply that program.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. So you ask for clarification for certain matters from, especially if I understood you right, Sverker Sörlin and David Nilsson's report. And maybe before we go on, you would like to comment, Sverker or David. I was thinking maybe first on the matter that when you state that wealth is becoming a greater problem than poverty, if you would like to dwell on that. I don't know, David or?
Okay, thank you.
Please.
Yes. Why is wealth? Why is that a problem for development policy? That is what you're asking, Anna Maria. And I think that we have to start a little bit from the first proposition, that we have these shared challenges, and they are shared in a different way than they were in the 70s. I think we all agree that we have a problem of overconsumption. We have a problem of unsustainable lifestyles. And that is what's happening when wealth is spreading across the world. So therefore we get shall we say, a conflict of, a contradiction in the objectives. On one hand, we want to reduce poverty. We want to make people at least richer. At the same time, we know that in our part of the world, in the rich part of the world, we are having a notorious appetite for natural resources, etc. So we end up with a rich world which is completely unsustainable. And this we know. And this is why we have processes like the IPCC, why we have had a very large breakthrough of the ideas around the Anthropocene, the planetary boundaries. We are approaching or have already crossed the planetary boundaries, and that is because a lot of the wealth that we have created. So then the question is, why then should we have different goals for national policy and for development policy? Why should development policy not take on the problem of the wealth in the world, or vice versa? Why should not poverty and the eradication of poverty and sustainable development become part of national policy? Of course it should, and we have said that several times. We have the policy for global development since 2003 in Sweden, and still we tend to look at these issues as separate tracks, and that is one of the things that we really say, is that the way forward? And we think it's not, and that's why we have to start looking at other ways of contextualizing the entire global challenges, and we can't do that if we keep those two sort of tracks separate. That's why we have to talk about wealth also in development policy.
Thank you, Sverker Sörlin.
Yes, and then there was this second question about clarification on some of the points in the 8 propositions. Maybe these 8 propositions should be regarded not as conclusions or solutions, but rather as terms of reference for a process moving forward, where all kinds of agencies in Sweden, but also global and international programs, should be considered and certainly take part when it comes to the Swedish agencies. We have no set and fixed idea what a solution might look like, but when we refer to the government research bill of last year, it is because it is, in my view, innovative in that it provides broad programs with under the leadership or coordinated by research councils, so the research community is involved, and at the same time the long-term goals and directions of these programs are not only research oriented, they're also issues of relevance and impacts on society involved there. I would also like to point to the European Union here. A few decades ago, there was very little, if any, research collaboration in the European Union. It has grown. Some researchers complain of the bureaucracy and so on, but it's by and large demonstrated that it works successfully. It is, in and of itself, a long-term process, creative, bringing various nations and institutions together. I think we have to look at at research aid in the same way. And I think it's obvious then, in such a process, that established agencies with their ways of thinking about their activities, and maybe we should call it their home turf, will in an initial phase have to, of course, be a little bit brought out of their comfort zone. That is a good thing, I think. But the conversation itself and the search for solutions is what counts here over the long term. Because, and I would like to sort of reiterate the bottom line here, despite Sida doing a good job, and the evaluations that are upcoming will probably show the same thing, even if we would double the activities that we have, it would still be too marginal to speak to the major issues we're talking about here. Broader collaborations is the only way forward, I would like to say. We couldn't sit idle in the compartments that we have created from before. And that is why I'd like to see that we do have examples. They are in the European Union collaborations. They are in the recent research bill. There would be other templates. You mentioned yourself the ISSC program that Sida was funding, but Sida cannot fund everything. We need to find also broader partnership elsewhere. That is not easy, but I think it's the way forward here if we want to make more major changes that I think the world needs.
Thank you. Speaking of collaborations, Göran Tomson earlier emphasized the need to breaking the silos between different departments. And Eva Tobisson, from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs point of view, do you agree with this? And what do you learn from these two reports?
Thank you very much. Yes, I agree, but it takes a long time to be able to explain the way we work within the government offices, because that's part of how we break the silos. It sounds easy to communicate over political or policy borders, but it's not always like that. We all defend our... Oh, sorry. We all... sorry, can you hear me now? We all defend our sort of political areas and policy areas. So this is, but I'll come back to that. But I just wanted to say a few words which I've been thinking of, maybe not so much focusing on details in the report, but really to say that this is a rare occasion, a unique opportunity for policy and research to meet. And I think I've been working with the ministry for 15 years. I've been in research for, 30 years before that, and even on my sort of free time now. So I can understand both needs and ways of working, but we need research to inform policy, that's for sure. But it's very, very difficult to get at the point that you actually can use it. Researchers can also find a lot in policy, and we have examples here, and there are other examples as well, that there is a lot to dig into to make. For those of us who are researchers who want also to be useful and who want policymakers to read to take in our results, it's important to study, to know a lot about policy if you're a researcher. Start off by really getting the latest knowledge in order to start off at a point where you can also attract the attention of the policymakers, so that they don't just say that, this is not the case, or we've done that before, or we've been... Dialogue is very important. But also we have different ways of working and different time frames. Research, for obvious reasons, have to spend time to get at evidence. Policymakers, politicians need answers right now. And here you see it's tremendously difficult. And still policymakers, politicians speak about aid, development cooperation, or any policy area should be evidence-based. This is what we hear in speeches. But, how true is that given the conditions we have as civil servants in the organization, as politicians, to actually access the latest research, study it, and use it? So this is just sort of to be frank, that there is a problem of communication, and there is still a serious gap between policy and research, I would say. So I think that, again, this is more general, but I think for this audience it's important that we need researchers who are interested to influence policy, to pack the research in a reader-friendly way. It's an old saying, but it's still relevant. Policy briefs, seminars like this one, where one can have sort of prepared questions and focus, so that we can get further. And for policy, people like me and politicians, we need to take the time to study research in the areas where we work as policymakers. And this is tremendously important. And then, of course, it helps if you can access briefs and so forth. But we also need access to researchers. So provoke us, invite yourself to the minister, say, hey, I got something to tell you. Let's meet and talk. And this very rarely happens, in fact. SLU is one example among several, and there are examples, but we can take more of that, I would say, on a sort of, perhaps not the details, but sort of general. Just a word on policy framework directing research, because we're talking both about development cooperation and we're talking about the general policy for research in Sweden. I think it's important just to say that, everybody knows here that we have a strategy, a long-term strategy for directing research collaboration as part of aid. the government decides what, that's in the strategy. The agencies decide how to get at the results and to reach the goal. And this gives the agencies such as Sida and the Science Council great freedom to actually try out new ways to reach the goals and to attain the results. And this is why, if we're talking now about development cooperation and research as part of that, it's not static, it's changing all the time. Even if we're using the same labels, for instance, in the new strategy, a fairly new strategy for research collaboration funded by aid, you have capacity building, you have research of relevance, there is innovation, and there is support for Swedish research of relevance for development. But it gives a freedom to the agencies to do a lot of things which were not done a few years ago. And we sort of, as government, we don't direct the details, but the exciting things are happening all the time. So please don't look upon work as static, because it's not. The problem of coherence, yes, and that brings me to a short comment on the national research policy and the new bill. Because I think that the real transformative change is when people are not talking about the need for aid funds to support research in developing countries, but using other funds. That's, for me, is transformative change. And actually the work with the bill I was part of that work in an interdepartmental working group. The discussions are very often blocked by, are there aid money to fund this? No, because we didn't have any aid money in the propositions in the bill. But we were working hard to make sure that other areas with other funds saw the need for supporting research in developing countries and working together with research. It's good quality research in developing countries. And that I look upon the bill as it is opening doors for lots of things, including funding from not from the aid budget. So at least that is achieved, that there are opportunities, but unless we look beyond aid for funding research in other parts of the world, we won't get very far, because aid budget is and will always be limited, and there will always be competition between areas. We can talk about that at another occasion, the research in relation to other areas, but I'm still looking for initiatives from, and there are such initiatives, but there could be much more. On the two studies, very briefly, I've been reading both of them with great interest, and I've been following a bit more closely Fellesson's report because I've been part of the reference group. I think that's what we need, that it's not only, for me at least, it's 40 years of support for capacity building in Tanzania, what has been achieved. Now at least I can refer to a very sort of detailed study on that I can say that it's a lot, and it's, among other things, this and that. So that report for me is very useful. And I think it's very important also to discuss internationalization in research and higher education. And by the way, higher education is a forgotten area, but the new policy framework for aid, at least we have it mentioned, because we have a chapter on the thematic sort of part of the aid framework, which is on education and research. And strategically, it was a way for us to put higher education in the middle so that one can look upon higher education. And I'm looking at you, because we're always criticized for not focusing on higher education. I agree, but it's not what's in now for Sida, for the work that you are carrying out. Also, Nilsson's report. I think that Anna-Maria has mentioned the things I would like to bring up as well. But I would really say, I would in a way say that a lot of these things are already going on, which you put up as propositions. And for me, it's like, had you come at an early stage of the study, maybe we could have sort of lifted up the starting point of the propositions to slightly higher level, where you could say, this is already done by Sida. Sida is determining what to do on the how, and the Science Council. But, I mean, the shared Agenda 2030, the shift of postgraduate training to the countries we work with, and so forth. This is already going on. Could be more of it, but I find the report very useful as well, and I like the historical chapter very much, even if it has been, as you were saying, documented, but not in the way that you have done it, linking it to foreign policy and so forth, which I think is new. So I think I stop there. Sorry to
Thank you so much, Eva. We are a bit short of time, and I would like the audience to have time for some questions as well. So I just ask you to keep your remarks a bit short. Rolf Höijer from the Ministry of Education and Research. Eva started out with saying that it is hard to work over the borders, over the political borders. I would like to hear your view on the need of collaboration between the two departments, and also another question from the Swedish universities' point of view. Which would you say are the benefits from international collaboration?
Thanks very much. So we're here, I think, discussing the intersection of research policy on one hand and AIDS policy on the other hand, and I come mostly from the research policy side. Now, I will try to answer those questions. I think these two reports have really provided very valuable material and given us an opportunity to talk about these issues. I think that
just a bit closer to the microphone, please.
I think that Måns Fellesson's report provides a fairly solid evidence base regarding what has actually happened to these Ph.D. educatees. I think some important conclusions from myself personally, without being a specialist in this field, that obviously if you do train people to this advanced level, they need to get opportunities to exercise that competence and actually conduct research once they are finished with the degrees. It's also important that they are able to be mobile so that their knowledge and competence is not locked in. They need to be able to move between institutions and collaborate internationally, etc. So I do think that provides a very solid evidence base that is useful for us. Now, as for the Sörlin and Nilsson report, I think that it contains, fortunately, a fairly clear summary in a number of propositions or reference points that can be discussed in a efficient manner in that way. I would agree. I take one of the main propositions to be that on the whole, for a number of years, research policy on one hand and the aid policy on the other hand have been fairly compartmentalized. There's been some minor modifications to that in the last few years with the Swedish Research Council, but as a general proposition, I think it's probably true. And I think it's also true that for example, that there has been limited attention paid to social sciences and humanities. It probably should be more. Now, there is also propositions to the effects that nowadays we share international problems or challenges to such an effect that such a compartmentalization is no longer useful or efficient. And I think on the whole that is also a true proposition. I don't think that the Swedish government, as far as I know, have a set of clearly formulated policy positions as regards the specific interaction between research policy on one hand and aid policy on the other hand. You have detailed propositions in each area, but not on the relations, I think. And so what I'm stating is, yes, my personal assessment, but my assessment is that that's probably true. I think there would probably be scope for some further integration in order to address these joint challenges to a larger extent. But not only because there are joint challenges, but also because there is some benefits that can be reaped just by integration in itself, such as cooperation, competition, and also cross-fertilization within science. So I think that has been addressed both by changes in how Sida work and the involvement of the Swedish Research Council. But I think there's probably still more scope to further advance this. Now, if we go on to discuss the challenges, yes, I do believe that there are some such challenges. Some of them are probably mentioned in the research bill, but it should, in all honesty, I think also be remarked that some of the challenges may not be those that the authors conclude necessarily. Whether or not wealth is a problem or not has already been mentioned. I think that for many people, wealth would be regarded as a benefit, not the opposite. And the problem of overconsumption is obviously, it's a contentious one. On these points and some other points, it's not very clear how a specific data set in the report serves as a foundation for inferences about these conclusions. But I think it's probably true that there are some joint challenges to be addressed, but there is probably some controversy as about what those particular challenges are. Another proposition that I suspect may not be shared by the office is that if you do have a more joint undertaking of research policy on one hand and aid policy on the other hand, I suspect that the shift would be a little bit away from aid policy as we know it today and towards a more generalized national research policy as we know it. I'm thinking both in terms of size effects that the national research policy is so much larger in monetary terms than the aid research policy is. But also we will have to probably benefit from certain kinds of spillover effects that Sweden needs to import knowledge itself. We only produce, what, maybe 1% of all articles produced in the world. For all practical purposes, we need to import knowledge. And in the same way, other developing nations will need to benefit from knowledge produced locally here. So I think that returns in some sense to your question about what can you Swedish universities gain from collaboration. It's completely necessary. Sweden is simply too small a player to be able to act by itself. They have to interact with others, with developing nations and researchers, but also with others. But there is some fear, I think, that if we have this joint undertaking, it may be some shift of gravitation away from aid policy as we know it. Because if researchers are to freely organize, I think many of them will think that there is still a greater capacity for high-quality research in more developed nations, and they will tend to form partnerships in such a manner. So personally, I think there is some scope for having a more joint undertaking, but if one wants to retain a space for capacity building, I think there is also probably some reasons to maintain some degree of compartmentalization to some extent, at least in terms of budgetary terms, but this is my personal guess.
Thank you. I'm going to take questions from the audience. I have one important question that I would like to ask you, Mr. Nnadozie, and it's a thing brought up by Måns Fellesson, and it's about the uneven premises in international collaboration and the need to make the partnership and the cooperation more equal. And I'm just curious, Mr. Nnadozie, to hear your view on this and how to address these really serious challenges. Please.
Okay, thank you for the question. I do have other questions I would like to respond to, but given that time is of essence, let me respond to this particular one at this point in time. It's a very important issue, which I also highlighted that is a risk that is recognized by the report, and that's very good. But it is a risk that is also not easily resolved, that it has a potential to continue. But we need to ask ourselves, why is this something that has a tendency to occur? And imagine that you're a young researcher from Sweden who is trying to make a mark for themselves, a name for themselves. They're in the university, publish or perish, and their research is in Africa where they have collaborators. Now, what incentive mechanism do they have to be able to say, let me have those who did this research with me have the limelight or be the leaders, and I will not be. So there is a real issue there we need to look at fundamentally. It's not necessarily changing the mechanism for recognition or for reward or incentives, but it is also to understand that there are certain dynamics that are in play that in most instances would force people to actually either maintain this kind of exploitative approach to research, if I may use the word that way, and the other. But I'm very happy that the reports have highlighted this issue, which I believe is of great importance and that needs to be tackled. And it is something that I believe that if it is tackled in a way that will be a win-win for everybody, that in that kind of situation you would see that there will be more willingness and opportunity for expanding the partnerships and the collaborative work that everybody agrees is quite important at this point in time.
Thank you very much. And now, I know we have 2 microphones, so you can just put up your hand if you have a question for the panel. No? I thought you were so eager asking questions here. Yes, please. And please introduce yourself, if you would like to.
Arne Biksten, Gothenburg University and EBA. I think this has been interesting and very complimentary to reports.
Please, a little bit closer. Thank you.
And as we see, the Swedish research collaboration so far has been bilateral, multilateral, international organizations, and the Swedish links. And I think all 3 of those are important even in the future. But a lot of the discussion has been quite general, and I think one needs to think about how to get from here to concrete action at Sida or in other contexts. And to my mind, to be able to these global challenges and the local context of those, you need to develop the capacity in developing countries to be serious players here. And the challenging question is, how do you get them better linked up to the international research community and have a capacity to do their own research? And the role of aid in this context, I think, is an interesting, the most interesting dimension. And how do you build capacity at university levels? I think the universities is a long-lasting institution of the world, and it's important to maintain it. I think that the key challenges to build up universities that function and where people can do research which is serious and which contributes to development as well. And this, I think, we should debate more. Actually, Måns had some suggestions as to what one can do more concretely, but that needs to be discussed further, I think. And also, going forward, when you look at the way the whole aid business is changing, I think it's going to be much more in the direction of other types of relationships, where, for example, mutual research projects are going to be more important than traditional projects of building a road or building a school or something like that. There's going to be much more integration or equal players. And if you are serious about this thing about ownership, which we have been talking about for 15 years at least, then to build up capacity to have their own research capacity to participate on an equal footing or more equal footing with the rest of the world, then the university and the intellectual environment there is really, really important. It's also important to these countries that universities are able to be sort of freedom of speech havens in a way in some of these places. But I think the focus should be, or I think the interesting focus of discussion is, how do you make these institutions called universities better, more competitive and better integrated to the rest of the world and being able to contribute to development? I mean, the research agendas, we can then discuss when these institutions are there, but we need to...
Thank you so much for your remarks. And we can be sure about that the debate and the discussions about these big global challenges we have ahead will go on. But right now we have to end this discussion, and I would like to say thank you to the panel, and we have some final remarks from Gun-Britt Andersson. Yes, an applause for the panel.
Yes, thank you all very much, and thank you, Gabriella, for managing this big panel. But I think you got the best out of it, and maybe we should have had more time to listen to the audience also, but I hope you can go back home with some new thoughts, and you will get back to the policymakers that will make change in this field. I think it has been a very rich seminar, and we have had 2 good reports that have fed the discussion very well. And I think you are in agreement that we are living through difficult times and very special times, and that there is a need to focus, to maybe revive our thinking about what we should do in research, in the research community, but also development cooperation community, what role they should take in this. You are also in agreement that global issues, we have a lot of global challenges that we share. But I think it's also very important to note that global issues are local issues too. And in order to be able to deal with the global issues and to handle them, there need to be capacity on the ground everywhere so that can link up to start to discuss the problem in a way that will be a bit inclusive and maybe take all interest into consideration. We have a world that hasn't done that before, but I think we are at a time when we need to do that. So, capacity building, I'm sure, that it's a model that we should appreciate, and we should see how we can develop it further. And I hope that is a message that policymakers will listen to. But at the same time, I think we need also to do the new thinking, and I am very happy with the report by Sörlin and Nilsson that they provoke this discussion. We know that and Sörker is saying, we're always been doing that. Sida, we have taken on all new challenges. But it hasn't been much heard of outside the rooms where people are. And there hasn't been a lot of sort of public understanding that this is an important issue. And if this seminar and the reports can contribute to make it sort of, to attract new interest to a very important issue, we are very happy, and we'll still listen to you. We have done it all. But there's much more to do in the future, building on what we have done. And maybe that's one of the, I'm not in a position to propose anything, but I think one thing that can happen now is that we should, there is now a demand for how to implement the 2030 agenda and what role science and technology and research should have there. At least there is a lot of talk about it. We know that talk doesn't always lead to action, but there we have a chance of sort of bringing our experience from capacity building that has been a bit unique over the years. We remember when the World Bank completely abstained from funding universities because some ministers have said there should be primary education only, and things like that. But we have maintained that comprehensive approach to capacity building over the years, and that is something I think that could be in demand now, and where we could be something. But maybe we could also be innovative on how to bring the research and the development communities together better by introducing a couple of challenge programs co-funded by the research budget and the general research budget and the Sida budget. And there are many issues, there's climate, there's a lot of things that we need to do together. But maybe one thing, how to enter a new era of enlightenment could be a challenge program that would fit with Sörlin's philosophy and I think what we need with our needs. So there's a lot more to be done, and we hope that this seminar has inspired you the way EBA wants to inspire, to bring policymakers, researchers, and an interesting public together. I have a couple of very important announcements. I think EBA has shown, we have produced a lot by now. We will continue to produce and to have challenges. And we have for some time had a couple of vacancies, but they are now filled, and I can announce that today. We have a new chair of EBA, and that is Helena Lindholm. And also Yeah. Yeah. I have been the acting chair waiting for you, and I'm very happy to you can replace me here. I'm very happy to leave that chair to you. And then there was 2 vacancies, one after actually Hans Rosling. And he, of course, left a scar in our board, but it will be filled by Johan Skar. Is it the right pronunciation? Skar. Johan Skar. Yeah? And you know him all very well. He's quite an expert on both health and fragile states. He has recently been the former head of the Jerusalem Cooperation, of the Swedish cooperation with the Palestinian authorities in Jerusalem. And then Fredrik Uggla, a professor in political science, will also come into the board. So we are very happy with that. We are also trying, EBA, to contribute to postdoc development. And that is maybe an idea for Africa Capacity Building Foundation. EBA offers newly graduated PhDs to make a brief on their thesis, if there is a relevant topic on development. And then we print it and we offer them a seminar like this, and on a special theme. And on the 14th of June, there will be such a seminar with 5 young scientists that have written on sexual rights, sexual reproduction and health rights. I never know, the SRHR. And a very, very important field right now in the Trumpist area. And that they will present their thesis here, and there will be opponents and so on. So then maybe this is something ACBF could think of in Africa to promote postdoc there. Also, I want to make another announcement, and that is that the Africa Capacity Building report on research will be presented tomorrow at IDEA. And everybody is welcome there. From 10 o'clock, and IDEA is a partner in Sweden of ACBF. You have done a few things together in Africa. So you're all welcome there. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Vad sa du? Nej.